Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Ian here from Studio TV. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on mental health in schools and all that's going on. I'm joined by a good friend who is such a privilege to know, genuinely, who has so much to share. And we were just chatting before we came on air, before we came live, and talking about what an amazing job you folks in schools do, and what we kind of hope this will be as a bit of a session. And we hope we can share lots of really good information, but we hope also that you'll very much know that you're doing an amazing job in schools, and we're really grateful for all you do for our children. So do know that. One of the things just before we kind of get started is just to kind of mention a little bit about who Ian is. Ian is the chief executive of a charity called Fegan, who work with schools, work with parents. Ian's a trained parent support worker, and does a load of stuff on how we can help our children be resilient and have really good mental health. He is a leading expert in this area, and again, really privileged that you've made the time to come and chat with us about all of this. Would you just introduce yourself to us just briefly again, and just so we know a little bit about you, and then we'll get into the.
My introduction could never be. Very gracious and generous. Yeah, I work for a charity called Fegan's. We provide qualified therapists into schools. We work with around 100 schools every week. We counsel in those schools about 400 children. Every therapist is qualified and paid. But over the last few years, what we've really tried to do is kind of not just work with the very vulnerable children, but also wrap around schools in terms of getting communities involved and working with parents, particularly ones that the schools are identifying, or sometimes social services are identifying having particular struggles. And really, in the light of the Green Paper, Ian and I were just chewing on mental health, the government's paper on mental health in schools. Is there something that we could do? And really, that's where this came from. You called me one evening, didn't you? Said, how could we do something here? And so here we are.
Yeah, it is, and that what we've tried to package up, what we've created, is something that I think is very helpful, and we'll obviously get onto that. Just before we get into the meat of things as well, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe, because there'll be loads of other stuff on this in this kind of area coming up as well, or like our Facebook page. Ian, would you just give us a bit of a picture of what the kind of state is of kind of mental health in schools state right now is from your point of view?
Yeah, okay. So I joined Fegan's, I guess, nearly 6 years ago. And I think what we've seen is two things that we were hard to anticipate at the time. One is increasing complexity of children presenting to us. And the other one is increasing volume. And that double whammy, I think, is playing out in schools in a huge way. And that's why actually the government, the coalition government and now the Conservative government over the last few years has been talking a lot about it. What that looks like, if you like it, on the ground, I think if we were to go, if we had a therapist in school for a day 6 years ago, that therapist would have 6 children, and maybe 4 of them would be quite anxious, and maybe one complex case, and then one, curveball, eating disorder or self-harm or something like that. Now you would probably find those numbers reversed, and we're seeing really complex issues, abuse issues, trauma issues, deep attachment issues, eating disorders, self-harm, and that's in the primary schools. We work in secondaries as well, but yeah, it's been complex. And then the sheer numbers of children, and and our colleagues in CAMS who obviously do this as part of the NHS, they get a lot of bad press, but we want to bless them in the sense that actually no one could foresee 5 years ago quite how this would escalate in the UK.
Yeah. we're obviously talking about, there's people from schools who are going to be watching. There's a massive burden in so many senses in schools. I mean, obviously we're talking about website stuff, mental health, loads, safeguarding, all sorts of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And the burden just seems to get bigger and bigger. And, you mentioned social workers and everything. We hear, don't we, that people in schools are acting as social workers as well.
Yeah.
What's going on in terms of the paper that you mentioned then? So if we're talking about specifically in schools, what does the burden look like?
Could you have, I think it's slide 12. Is it possible to bring up slide 12? So what the government did a couple of years ago was produce, just the one after that would be perfect, produce a green paper. Many of you will have heard about it, I'm sure. And essentially it gave 3 different things that schools needed to be aware of. The 4th doesn't really impact on school environments. The first one was a mental health lead in every school and college. And so the first thing is that there's a kind of a new burden on schools where the government is saying, well, you've got to have someone who's a specialist in this area. But the reality is there's very little money to go with that, meaning that schools are really, the ones that we're working with that have mental health leads, tend to be transitioning SENCOs, family liaison officers into that role as well. But without being able to increase their hours. So it's a great aspiration. We're for that aspiration, but it needs money behind it. And then if it's okay, I'm going to drop to the 3rd bullet point there, which is shorter waiting times to CAMHS. We're seeing that piloted in a couple of trailblazer areas, but again, the reality tends to be either they're being seen by unqualified practitioners or they're being seen for single session. And if you've got a child that's got significant, eating disorder or depression, we don't feel that that's adequate. The one that schools are most aware of and perhaps feeling the burden of, which I hope over the next few minutes we can relieve you of, I think, is that there should be mental health support teams working with schools and colleges. And Ian, is it okay to flip to the next slide as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is the one that no one is really talking about, but it is actually good news, as that slide says, because it's really about taking responsibility away from school leaders and SENCOs and mental health leads and saying, actually, how do groups of schools do that? So this is what the Green Paper says. They're open to a range of delivery models for the teams. For example, some teams could be led by groups of schools, others by voluntary and community sector organisations. We will fund mental health support teams. Good news, there's money via clinical commissioning. I know it's not often we hear that. Via CCGs, and expect schools, colleges, and other local partners to have a central role in the application process, key word there, key phrase there, and in designing and leading delivery. So the good news is that I think, firstly, it's not on a school head to say, how do I fix this? And I think that's great. And I think the second thing that you take from that is that there's money, and that's great. The kind of the ooh moment is that somehow schools have got together in clusters, and to be effective, that needs to be geographic rather than as part of a mat or something similar. So firstly, you've got to gather in clusters, and secondly, there's got to be an application process. What we've tried to do with schools, and I know other organisations are doing something similar, is really as a community to gather around schools and say, actually, how can we help you resolve this? How can we build that team that you need? And I think in terms of the Green Paper, whilst, if you like, having a mental health lead is the one that gets the newspaper headlines, whilst the CAMHS one is the one that everybody's hoping for and believing for, that's great. The real money shot, if you like, is the second one, and it's this one. And I think that, as we look at this as a community, as opposed to putting all on an individual school, there's hope for schools in the sense that communities need to gather around them.
It's really interesting, isn't it? What are your thoughts on what that community might look like then? Because when we think about time burden and cash burden, and everybody is fulfilling so many roles already, where do you think those types of people might come from within? Are you thinking maybe governors, or have you examples of any schools or groups of schools that are maybe doing that quite well? Yeah,
we've I could give you probably 4 different variations on the thing that we've seen in our experience, and they're all different, and therefore hopefully the principles of getting that person work. So for example, in a cluster in North Kent. It was a schools consultant who was gathering schools together, saying, actually, how do we do this? And her interest, if you like, was yes, of course, she'll be paid, but being paid by the group of schools. The schools all chipped in for her, and she did some work in terms of engaging with us, and we've made that work. Out of interest, that particular cluster is part funded by Children in Need. So when they came to us and said, we'd like this, it's 30 schools, so we want therapy across 30 schools, but we don't have the money. We took it on ourselves to go and support that. Another group is being led by 2 head teachers, where they've got together in a particular town and saying, actually, they came to us and said, how do we do this? And we've suggested getting so that local high sheriff is involved. We've got local community groups and churches involved, and they're launching community fundraising. We've had a vicar approach us. A young lad in their community killed themselves. CAMS couldn't get there. And so we created something around a dozen schools being funded partly by local churches, and if I'm really blunt, local wealthy people stepping into the gap. We've had private companies. My fourth one is we've had a private company come to us and say, look, well, we want to support you, and we really want you to go and work in a school that's fundable. And that school now has a fully fledged family hub where we're doing therapy. We've got 2 therapists in there actually, and parent support workers working with really vulnerable tier 4 type families. And that has been done with not very much money, but really about communities saying it. But you also mentioned governors. And I would say this is where we begin to sweat the governors. It's important. A lot of these guys are connected into the community, know people who can step into the gap. I'm not trying to put a burden on school leaders to say you need to lead everything for your local community. This is something that your governors can do. And we've been, my wife has just stepped down as a chair of governors of a local, our kids' primary school. And, she began to work the community in that context as well. So there's a few different ways of doing it and a few different ways of raising money. And actually very little of that comes back to the schools having to push. It is about engaging the community.
No, that's really helpful, isn't it? No, thank you. Is it all right for me to ask what Fegans might offer then in terms of support if anybody's watching, you think they might want to reach out to you?
No, genuinely, I didn't expect that answer. So what we found works. So we're working in a lot of schools, but what we found works is where clusters, geographic clusters of schools. So some of them are actually part of academies, trusts, multiple different academy trusts, but they're gathering geographically. And the reason why the geography works is to try and have some sort of mental health team in a local, for this school here and another one that's 40 minutes away. It doesn't really work. But if they're based in a local town, suddenly it becomes manageable for Fegans to be able to raise the money, so we go to local trust funds. So we've got, I don't know, 7 trust fund bids out at the moment, collectively are worth about £200,000, really, really significant money. And then we organise local community events where we gather the community together and say, are we going to do something? This is what's happening. Because of the work we do, we're able to give good stories that really motivate local communities. But we also don't just want people's money. We actually gather people to get involved. And that's why we train parent support workers to do that.
Okay. So
that's the sort of thing we do, but we do it geographically on clusters.
Okay. Talk to us about, because I know this has popped up as a conversation here in our office. Yeah. It's also part of the course that we're going to mention at some point, but is something that I know personally is in some instances certainly a gap. What on earth is attachment theory?
Right. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is go down to the local shoe shop, Timpson's, and the guy who founded Timpson's was. This
is amazing. This is amazing. When you told me this is what, a year or two ago. Honestly, it blows your socks off. This and it's true. When you hear something, you go, "I'm going to test it" because it sounds a bit ridiculous. The guy in the shop went, "Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about." Yeah.
So this is real. But behind the counter in Timpsons, so the guy who ran Timpsons, who founded it, fostered 90 children. And as a result of that, he wrote these cartoon books, take 2 minutes to read. and there's about 4 of them, everything from poor attachment to fostering kids and so on. And now our therapists, qualified therapists, who go to university for 4 years and then have to do another 2 years before they can come to us, 6 years of training, say these 2-minute read books are amazing. So I do that, but without covering too much of that ground. Every psychiatrist, every social worker, every therapist talks about attachment theory. It's essentially a framework of understanding relationships. And it starts from the get-go when the baby's born and mummy or daddy look at the kid and say, I love you, I love you, I love you. And what happens in this child's brain is they know I am loved, I'm adored, and they get a sense of identity from that. And incredibly, the emotional impact that we have on that child in those first few years particularly has a physical impact on the shape of their brain. What's difficult is if a child doesn't get that throughout their childhood, then they're not so sure of who they are. They're not so sure of their identity. And what that looks like in a classroom, if we can just make it schools-based, is they won't make friends so easily. They might be perhaps a bit more angry than they would have been otherwise. They'll be perhaps maybe a bit more violent, perhaps a little bit less aware of how other people, how other children feel if they're mean to them and so on. And actually what we try and do, as parents or as parent support workers or as teachers, educators, is to try and deal with the behavior, whereas the actual underlying issue is this child's background means that they've got poor attachment, and we need to get to the root of that. And it's not that I'm a tree hugger, particularly in saying, oh, don't worry about the behavior, it'll be fine, just give them a hug. But it is really, unfortunately, it sounds a bit like that. It is about saying, I hear you. And what that means is taking children aside for times in a day. Whilst I'm talking, Ian, is it okay if you just bring up, I think it's slide 12, the one with the round circle, if you like.
Yeah.
And by spending time with those kids, if we can set aside time in the day, and I know it's incredibly hard in the school, but if we invest time, even a few minutes, where we're saying to a child, I am for you, I approve of you, I think you're great. And if I've got time, I'll talk about a specific phrase. It's transformational in that child's life. Now, the problem here is what we're trying to do then in a school environment is make up for something that's happening at home. And I get that. And I know it's not your burden. I know actually you've got enough burdens and you're trying to educate kids. And now we're saying, well, actually attachment is on you. But the reality of why the government is targeting, if you like, the school environment is that's where kids who are fragile actually are. And that's where the behaviors manifest. And so the government isn't necessarily saying it's on schools to fix, it can be community groups and so on, but it is on schools to identify where this is. And this little wheel here might be able to give you a clue why. This is published by Public Health England, and it's the preventative factors in children not developing mental health illnesses, or we prefer to use the word resilience. How do you build resilience? And you can see effective parenting right there. And then the next one is effective teachers and schools. And it's quite interesting. It's not saying loving. It's not saying nice, it's saying effective. So it isn't about just being, a bit, oh, bless the child. It is about saying, actually, here are boundaries and actually there are consequences to that. And also, if we just skip around to positive relationships with caring adults, again, even if a child has a very difficult background, if there's an adult in their life somewhere that invests in them, and did we only need to think back to our own childhood? Mrs. Seeley, if you ever hear this, my English teacher, so it's caught me there, who just really invested in me because I came from a very troubled background. And Mrs. Seeley and Mrs. Walden invested in me. How do I remember that 40 years later? Because they went, Ian, I'm for you. And then if you keep going around, you can see other things, surprisingly, that build resilience, achievement, perceived efficiency. And this one there I wanted to pick up on is self-regulation. And it might be that one-on-one time is simply where we say, I see that you are frustrated. How do we work with that? And that's a great thing to be able to do with a child. It's just to acknowledge the emotion that they're feeling. And often children escalate their feelings because they're just not feeling heard. But the moment we say, I see that you're angry, I see that you're upset, they know that they're heard. And without going into brain patterns at the moment, you speak straight into the seat of their emotions, their limbic system. And it's a really precious thing. So it's a little bit of a burden on teachers, but honestly, I think it's a burden that teachers carry anyway. And hopefully there's some tips in there as to how they might address that. Does that answer the question, Ian? Is that?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and from my personal point of view, I guess nobody else will, but our son, one of our older children, is he's left home now, but we had a permanent residence order for him, so sort of adopted but not, and I know a lot of this stuff would have been really helpful for us to have known ages ago. I mean, my kind of living with it, it's so hard when these kids, they kind of manifest as just naughty kids, don't they? And I think a massive thing that I've learned, having had chats with you certainly, is that it's not that's not the deal. That's not what's going on. And what the knowledge that just from chatting with Ian over the last couple of years, but also the information that's in the course that we'll get to, has really helped me understand where he was coming from. And actually, not that long ago, say to him, look, actually, there's a lot of people that cocked up in your early years, and somebody needs to say that to you. Somebody needs to acknowledge to you that, you know, you've been let down, you know. So it's massively helpful. Just explain a little bit for us then, if you don't mind, Ian, about what self-regulation means. So that means nothing to me.
Well, when I talk about self-regulation, I normally start by saying I get anxious, you know, and even in my job, I get anxious. And as a culture, we've kind of pigeonholed anxiousness as an always bad thing. Actually, it's rooted in survival. So in fact, it's actually quite a good thing. You know, if you're not anxious when you cross the road or the M25, you're going to get hit. So anxiety in itself is not bad. It's when it begins to get out of control that's very difficult. And unless we begin to regulate anxiety and get it in proportion, if you like, then it can do. And that's when therapists have to step in to be able to teach self-regulation in therapy. But I think it's good for us all to acknowledge that sometimes, you know, we get angry, sometimes we get depressed, sometimes, you know, we're suffering with anxiety and so on. And when we acknowledge that, to say, well, what do we do about that? And it's about sometimes sharing it. And we're going to talk about self-care, I think, for a short period of time. It's about sharing it. It's about acknowledging what you're going through and accepting that that's there and saying, okay, I feel anxious about this situation, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so what happens is we get used to kind of working with or alongside the anxiety, and we don't get into this vortex of, but what if, but what if, but what if, but what if. We have to say, well, okay, it might happen, but if it does, I know what I'm going to do. There's lots of different ways of addressing it, but self-regulation is sometimes about saying to a child, I know you're anxious. I am anxious sometimes too. But sometimes, you know, we're just going to have to just try the maths problem. We are just going to have to try the PE and try football and see what happens and see how it works out. And what the child does, particularly as they watch us model that behavior, is they go, okay, this emotion isn't going to overwhelm me. It's normal. But if we're not acknowledging that, what can happen is the children go through this cycle. I don't know if I've got time to talk about it now, where, you know, there's a cycle of being overwhelmed, where there's, you know, they're emotional in any way, and they're feeling a bit overwhelmed perhaps by life. Perhaps there's something going on, and then a big incident happens. Mum and dad separate. They get bullied at school, or they see something on the internet, and suddenly what becomes an overwhelming sense is something that literally washes over them, and they're unable to cope. Because no one has really sat down with them and said, well, actually, it's okay to feel like that. It's okay. And this is what you do next. And as a result of that, actually, a lot of our children are beginning to say, well, I will find another mechanism for coping. And if you look at something, I don't know, like self-harm or eating disorders, it's rooted in the fact they weren't able to manage some of these things at the beginning, because no one really sat down with them and said how to do it. So, you know, my heart is if we can catch this stuff in primary school children, particularly, you know, in years sort of 2, 3, 4, in those, and teach them to be able to manage those behaviors, then we've got a real strong shot at actually stuff not manifesting so profoundly later on.
That's amazing. You touched on self-care then, and again, it's going back to that burden on those working in schools, which I don't really have a concept of, to be honest with you, but I'm aware of it. What are we talking about when we talk about self-care? How important is that? What could we do?
I think the best place to start is with a statement that no human being is equipped to continuously take the burdens of other human beings and just hold them all internally. So anyone who thinks, oh yeah, I can just walk through life and deal with all of this, if we don't, it will manifest in one way or another. Maybe a lack of self-regulation, angry, maybe anxiety, maybe a sense of dread. For me, I chaired Fegan's safeguarding team for a couple of years, and it impacted me in ways that are really profound. And what I found was that I needed a place to offload that. Self-care, ironically, isn't about how I care for myself, how I do it. It's really about how we offload those burdens onto other people. So, for example, our therapists, every month, they go for an hour and a half clinical supervision. Clinical supervision isn't anything really grander than sharing the things that have really impacted that therapist, literally sicking up over that supervisor. And it's not a new principle, it's got a new name, but the Catholic Church has been doing it for centuries, where you go into the priest once a week, you confess all your darkest secrets, and you come out and feel great. And actually the reason it's effective is that bearing of your soul. If we don't do it, what we're basically doing is holding all of that stuff in a body that doesn't have the emotional capacity. We can just about bear our own emotional burdens, but to try and hold, Jimmy's going through this at home, and Jane's got that, and Ishmael's got this, and take on all of their burdens, not possible. So ideally, in an ideal world, what we'd say is that every teacher should have clinical supervision. But the reality is budgets don't stretch to that. And so if I had a couple of other top tips for today, I would talk about, if your school is stretched like this, make sure that somewhere once a month, your teachers and TAs, and even actually any staff that engage with the children, have somewhere where they can get into a room. You can do it as a group, and you ask a few open questions. How are you feeling? What's impacted you this month? And I know, again, it sounds like I'm a bit like they're super cocky. I'm not. This is a very practical thing to trigger people saying, well, actually, this kid did this to me. They hit me, or they unburdened this on me, or I met this parent and they said this about me, and I really struggled. It's that sharing that stuff that we're burdening with late at night, and you kind of stick it out into the middle of the room. Everybody cries. Right, you just cry. There's a room of 8, 10 of you, and you just weep. I would say that no more than that. You weep and weep and weep. You look after each other, and then the moderator who's been doing this says, okay, and they close it up. Okay, a bit like coming out of confession, we go back and we can function again as human beings. We need that moderator who's ever led that group. They need to have then real clinical supervision. So that will cost a bit of money, but you're talking about £100 a month maybe, but it will protect that moderator. They're likely to be the Senko or deputy head teacher or safeguarding lead or something like that, and they will have heard the worst of the worst, and they need somewhere to offload that, and and I would get that out of the school if I could. And then my other point on this is, I was with a director of education once, and he said his worst day of the week was Sunday evening, when all his head teachers called him to cry and say they don't want to go to school. And I just sort of shared this principle with him. Rather than wait till Sunday evening or to where the people can't bear it any longer, could you put in place a framework where these guys are regularly able to offload? And I just feel that if we've got a grip of that, we'd have a lot healthier school environments. I know it's hard, but actually, to me, of all the things, for £100 a month, you could look after your entire school team emotionally. That seems like a bargain to me.
Well, and there is, I can't remember the timings of it exactly, forgive me everybody, but there is a thing now, isn't there, where head teachers are responsible, obviously, specifically for the mental health of their staff. And I know that obviously there's governors having ultimate oversight responsibility from that point of view, but I think that's something that is actually actionable, isn't it? It's something that we could take away and put in place, and it's not going to cost the earth. That's a massive one. It can't cost the earth, but it's a huge thing. I think that leads me on to ask you about what would you say to those people who are looking after, say, the child who's maybe been through trauma or is exhibiting signs of attachment, and that what is the main thing that I need to be doing, bearing in mind that hopefully there's going to be people in school, there's going to be a structure to look after me. What is it that I maybe drill that home, the thing I need to be doing for that child day to day?
So are you talking as a parent or as a teacher?
As a teacher, I mean, it's everybody. It's all of us, isn't it? We talked about the kind of praise, that ongoing, unrelenting praise is where I'm getting to.
Yeah,
but it's all of us, isn't it?
So, I love praise. But when I talk about praise in an educational context, maybe I have a group of teachers in front of me and I say, "You're all amazing," and everybody sniggers a bit because I don't know them. How can I possibly say such a thing? And the second thing is amazing for what exactly? And they're looking maybe at a colleague thinking, well, I know they're not amazing. If it applies equally to them, this is meaningless. So the first thing I would say, if children have got poor attachment, one of the things that they don't know is that they're endorsed as a human being. And when we praise, even as a culture, I mean, you think about media influencers, we even think about, some of our own kids, what we've done, we tend to praise them on how they look. And you know what? That's the one thing they can't control. This is what they're born with. And I think it's lovely when we do praise, we praise for generosity, for kindness, for the amount of effort they put in. And no fault of any educator, but the school environment at the moment is very results orientated. And if kids are really smart, that's great. But I didn't do very well at school. What if the kids are like me? And I struggled at school. I came out of school feeling like a failure. I was a failure. What am I talking about? Feeling like one. And I think actually identifying that we need to focus on the amount of effort that they're putting in. So specific praise looks like this. Jane, I just love the way that you showed kindness by sharing your cake with Jamal. Bob, I love the way that you were you helped up that child who fell over off the floor. That showed real leadership. Katie, I love the way that you had so much courage when you took that test when you didn't want to take the test. I really admire that courage, and I want to tell you that your outcome doesn't really matter. The fact that you took that test is what impresses me. And and I walk this walk, with my own daughters. I got one taking GCSEs this summer, but I'm taking her out for a celebratory meal, not when she gets the results, but when she's finished the work, because she's just worked so hard. And who cares? Who cares about the results? Mine suck. Hers are going to be better than mine. And I've done okay. It's about honouring, the kind of person that they are. Yeah. I hope. The reason why it works with attachment, if I can just spend a moment or two on that, is in the limbic system. The limbic system is the seat of our emotions, and it's also where we make our decisions. And so if you say to someone, "You're amazing," you're talking really to their prefrontal cortex. It processes information. It doesn't have any impact on what they think about themselves, how they feel, or you as an individual. If you want someone to change the way they think, you have to speak to the limbic system, which is an emotional part of their brain, no capacity for language. So you have to demonstrate something, which might be an arm on the shoulder saying, and I'm just going to eyeball the camera for a moment, "You have done well," really, raise right into "you have done well." And that kind of thing speaks to their emotions, if we're specific about it. Does that? And what you'll see, hopefully, as a child, a few weeks of that, and children begin to restore. Ultimately, it's what a therapist does in a therapy room. There's no magic. Well, there is magic, but there's nothing that they can't do that a normal adult can't do in terms of putting love and security and a good attachment into a kid.
Okay, that's really cool. It is. Thanks, Ian. Just talk to us a little bit about this course. So obviously people watching may probably know, we're obviously from Studio TV, and what we've done is we've packaged up a range of online courses on a load of different stuff. It started with us wanting to make it easy for people who use our website software to keep on top of their skills. So we've put some online kit together to make that possible. But following conversations with people like Ian and a few others, it kind of led us to go, actually, we could do some really cool, really helpful stuff. And Ian and Fegan were looking at ways to, maybe reach a little bit further, which is why we've kind of partnered to create this course. I guess just to put it out there, the thing that is a biggie, because we've talked about cash, Ian, flying by the seat of my pants slightly here, but when we spoke on the phone not that long ago, imagine that, and not that long ago, you said what was really important, because obviously things we invest in this stuff to get it out there, but what was really important to you as an organisation was actually to just get people in front of it, and the course is not a lot of money. Yeah, it's not a lot of money. So I just wanted to mention that as a kind of thing, because it is there's so much information in there that's fabulous and so helpful and insightful. Ian, would you mind just talking us briefly through kind of how that came about and why you've decided to put the stuff in that you've put in now? And we've covered a bit of it, haven't we?
So I think the first thing is, when we're in schools and we're doing really complex work, complex therapy with vulnerable children, the aim of that therapy, I mean, if I went back 5 years, we'd try and make a child happier. And now what we're trying to do with therapy is build them enough of a thick skin or resilience to go and live with whatever sent them into the therapy room in the first place. And I think one of the hearts of this was, if we could release the children, okay, we can't get into every home, we'd love to, but we can't get into every home and to reach into the parents. But if there was a school environment that understood a little bit about what's going on inside a child's heart and head, and how to create an environment where A, children don't become so poorly, B, if they're going to become vulnerable, that how do you spot it and catch it and then minimize it, and then C, actually when you're watching something escalate, how do you intervene? And we wanted to do that, partly because it's just a great thing for schools to be able to do, partly because when we're working with these vulnerable children, we wanted them to go back into an environment that understood what had just happened. It wasn't like, they'd gone to see the Wizard of Oz in a therapy room for a while and then came out magically better. But actually, the school and teachers had an understanding of what was happening in there, and also how to maximize whatever our therapists were doing in the school environment. So it doesn't have to be one of our therapists. It could eventually be, you might be partnering with a local organization or something like that, but so that the work that you do, if you like, day to day with those very vulnerable kids isn't lost when they're back on the playground or back in the classroom. It gives a kind of a context to that. It does start at basics, it does, but we need to do that. We need to have a common basis and a framework so that we're not making assumptions on attachment. We're not making assumptions of what staff you've got. We've not assumed that there's a big budget. We're assuming that it's, you've only got the people that are currently on your payroll, and you've got to try and make this work. It's not trying to put burdens on, and if you do this and do this and do this and this, and here's a tick box of 50 items. It's really about maybe just creating the language and culture around the school so that it's a safe environment. Going back to that, that wheel, it addresses most of those things on that wheel, just trying to say, how do you do that in a school environment? And that's why we think it's worth it. And if I might, when we were at the school, we charged £41 an hour. Sorry, forgive me, £41 an hour. So over a course of a year, that adds up to about £7,000 a year to do a day's therapy. So we'll probably see somewhere in the region of 18, maybe 25 kids over the course of that year, right? But that's £7,000 for 18 children. And frankly, that's not sustainable as a nation. This course, the whole point of that is to stop that 18 being 18, maybe put it back to, the real complex cases, the 6 or 7. So Fegan's are directed, or whoever is directed at those 6 or 7, and the school can actually manage the rest. So actually, although it has an upfront cost, I'm too embarrassed to talk about money, but
I know, I hate it. But it's what it's.
We don't talk about money.
I know, and we hate it, and everybody hates it. But it's the big question we ask. And if I'm on the phone to somebody, it must have happened 4 times yesterday. We haven't got any money, don't you? It's a massive thing. But obviously, there's a cost to put something together. And manage it and run it on a platform, and the biggie is keeping that cost as low as possible. Well,
I think actually, if it gives comfort, So over 90% of Fegan staff are in front of children or families. We do this. It's not like we're in a think tank somewhere coming up with a course. This is stuff that we brought back from the front line to say this is the work that we're doing in all these schools. And we fundraise £500,000 a year, of which 200 grand we fundraise to support the work we do in schools. So this, any revenue that comes from this only goes plow back into schools. It's not, So if that gives comfort, that's what we're doing with it.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Let me just quickly put it up in front of people so they can see.
Okay.
That is a thing. There you go. That's there. So you'll find this on Studio TV, folks. There's a load of different stuff in here. As you see, it's £149 for the course, just so that's said and out of the way. But you'll see that on Studio TV.
I just couldn't even say it.
I know. I genuinely hate it. It's what it is. I've done the course. I've been through it from start to finish, as I say, from a point of view of obviously running the thing and getting ready to chat to Ian, but also from the point of view from quite a personal side of stuff as well. It has made a massive difference to my thinking and my approach to certain things. I genuinely can't speak highly enough of it. I would just, it's there. I think what I'll say is we'll follow this up. We'll obviously put links on for people to go and have a look and find out more information about it. Ian, you're a friend. You're an inspiration to us. I'm really grateful that you've shared so much of your time and so much information, so much of your knowledge and wisdom, dare I say it, with us. Is there anything else that you think would be really important to say before we wrap up?
If there's one takeaway apart from Timpson's, working in schools a lot, speaking to head teachers pretty much every week. I was talking to Senko at 8:30 this morning. She called me in some distress. I would say if there's one takeaway from today, look after your staff best you can, and if you want to reach out to me and ask 3 or 4, what kind of questions do I need to ask? I'd love to do that. But it's only what kind of a day have you had, what kind of a month have you had, what's keeping you from sleep. And if you do that, I just care for your people. And that's what we were talking about at the beginning. And for some time we just just to prioritize the teachers and all of this. So that'd be great.
Ian, thanks so much. Again,
thank you.
Very grateful. And thanks everybody for watching. If you want to get in touch with us, I'll say we'll put some information alongside the video so that you've got that info. And love to hear from you. But thanks again, Ian.
My pleasure.